The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, I'd like to call this meeting to order. First off, I want to say tonight's meeting is informational in nature and no action will be taken by the commission. And with that, can we get the roll call, please?
Chairperson Boschert.
Here.
Vice Chair McConnell.
Excused.
Commissioner Carpenter.
Looks like he's excused.
Commissioner Calling.
Here.
Commissioner Dunn.
Present.
Commissioner Tomacek.
I believe he's excused.
Commissioner Mayo.
Here.
Commissioner Zhang.
Present.
And Commissioner Torres.
It looks like she's excused as well.
Roll call is complete.
So we have 4 regular commissioners and 1 alternate. So everyone will be voting tonight. We have a quorum. Can I well, I guess before we do that, we need to state that, well, no, that comes later. So first, can we get a motion to approve the meeting minutes for April 27th?
So moved.
Can I get a second?
Second then?
And do we have a voice vote or do you need to call roll, Jennifer?
Roll call, please.
Okay. Do I call it or do you?
You ask for the roll call vote and then I will call you by name.
Okay, let's go ahead and have a vote.
Chair Boschert.
Yay.
Chair Boschert is in favor. Chair Calling, or excuse me, Commissioner Calling.
Yes.
Commissioner Calling is in favor. Commissioner Dunn.
Yes.
Commissioner Dunn is in favor. Commissioner Mayo.
Yes.
Commissioner Mayo is in favor. Commissioner Zhang.
Yes.
Commissioner Zhang is in favor. Vote is complete.
The minutes are approved unanimously. All right. Due to COVID-19 and the pandemic, comments were accepted electronically and via voicemail and were delivered to the Planning Commission and posted on the public agenda packet. Jennifer, do we have any voicemail comments tonight?
We do have one voicemail comment, and our IT partners will be playing that into the meeting for us now.
And we received some email comments, and we've all gotten a copy of those.
That is correct.
Does Matt go do the voicemail now or after the presentation?
He will go ahead and play that now for us.
Thank you.
My name is Karen Ray, 4060 Shaw Boulevard, Westminster. These are public comments on the new Business Point Water Supply Report to the Planning Commission, May 11th, 2021. I've read through the summary provided to commissioners tonight and find flaw in the conclusions being made. While this commission is made up of local business representatives and not scientists or environmental experts, you are being asked to weigh in on decisions that will affect the health and well-being of residents now and in the future. Actions that are taken today will have monumental impacts on what life will be like in the future. What is normal? Climate science says more weather extremes, more droughts, and ongoing global warming. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration report released just on May 4th, 2021, shows that most of Colorado, including the Front Range, is warming and drying. That report can be viewed in yesterday's Denver Post. The City Water Supply Report offers different scenarios and hopeful thinking that projects the best case scenario, one with minimal climate change, even greater conservation on the part of residents, and finding alternative water resources as a scenario that the city makes decisions, planning, and development based on. The report acts as more of a justification to the current build-out plans than an objective, science-based analysis of the current finite water supplies and escalating impacts of climate change. Without balancing the equation, the only assumption that can be made is that the problem is being kicked down the road. And this is really not an option today. We are living through a continuing drought, as seen in 2020 with some of the worst fires in our state's history. The effects of the continuing changing climate are just being realized and accepted as the normal cities must adjust to. And cities must change behaviors and habits, stop acting as though our resources are limitless, reevaluate the way they build, and implement land preservation and conservation as part of the effort to lessen the impacts of climate change. We cannot accept a gap in water supply and demand. We cannot sell our future and think that someone else will figure it out down the road. This report is flawed in its conclusions on how the city should plan for the future. Water is a finite resource, and the fact is that resource is literally drying up. Thank you.
That concludes the voicemail portion.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and state that there's only one item on tonight's agenda, and that is the water supply plan information presentation. Sarah, I believe you're up.
Chairperson. Oh, see, I'm almost there. There we go. Chairperson Butcher and commissioners, I am actually really excited to be here tonight to talk to you. I appreciate you inviting me. I have a you are able to see my screen. I believe you are. I do have a presentation tonight, but as Jennifer mentioned, I do want to make sure that I'm answering questions. So to the extent that you're comfortable with it, I'm happy to accept questions at any point in the presentation. So with that, I'll get started. And actually, before we get into the meat of it, we've got Andrew Spurgeon on the call. And I have been so thankful to have such an amazing group of people in community development to work with. The comprehensive plan and the water supply plan are so integrally linked. And this has been a long effort between both public works and utilities and community development to make sure that this is a plan that works for the comprehensive plan, a plan that also ensures that we have water supply both now and into the future. So a big shout out to our partners in community development for all of their hard work in helping us develop this. So let's see. So before we get into the details, I want to go through a few of the key takeaways that we learned through this process. And the first one is something that you'll hear frequently from us, and that is that water conservation is our single biggest lever to make meaningful impacts to the city's water resiliency against drought, climate change, and development plans. And we'll talk more about why we think that later on in the presentation. Second, the water supply plan can support the likely land use map in the 2040 comp plan if those current conservation trends continue. And the last is that the potential for experiencing a drought more severe than what we've seen in the history of the city is high. So there's an important differentiation that I want to make before we start talking about the results of the water supply plan. And that is this question of, do we have enough water for today's needs? The water supply plan is really a 2040 focused document. It is not looking at today. And the reason for that is that we largely already understand our existing customers, what their needs are, and what our water supply system can produce. The short answer is, can we support today's water needs? The answer is a yes. However, just like others in the Front Range and across the Desert West, we are far from immune to drought. Drought restrictions may need to be implemented in times of water stress. So looking back at the 2014 water supply plan, which was completed alongside the last comp plan amendment, there are a lot of metrics that go into developing a water supply plan. Things such as historic measured flow in Clear Creek, water rights, how we use water indoor and outdoor. And the 2014 plan was a single future. So we had to make assumptions about each one of these things. We had to make an assumption about what Clear Creek would do, which is where most of our water supply comes from. We had to make assumptions about how our community would use water in the future. Does residential use more or less water, more indoor, more outdoor? So we had to make assumptions about all of those things. And there was a lot of research that went into those, but ultimately the results of that analysis results in a water supply where we have 31,300 acre feet worth of water, a demand of 33,300 acre feet of water, and then you just do the simple math and you get this gap of 2,000 acre feet. And what's important here is that this is a single estimate of the future. And there is a lot of variability here that doesn't get taken into account. So why do this water supply plan update? There are, for one, this is doing a full analysis of the water supply plan is a major effort. It has taken us about 3 years to get to this point, to do all the background work that happened prior to us joining the results of our preliminary work to the comp plan. So we're happy to be here, finally finished with that effort, but it isn't something we can do every year. And of course, the main effort here is to ensure that we're aligning the water supply plan with the comprehensive plan goals. The other piece that we really wanted to look into was do a more intensive analysis to allow for the evaluation of the potential range for available water supply, a greater understanding of this land use water nexus, which is a fancy way of saying how do different land use types use water differently, and then understand the risk of significant drought and climate change. These are all variables that we had to make assumptions about. We wanted to understand more clearly how much risk we had for each of these four issues. So this was a really exciting process for us. I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to this stuff, and I work with a lot of really fabulous people that did this analysis, and we were able to utilize new and emerging technologies and methodologies that really just weren't available in 2014. We ran literally millions of model runs instead of just one. And to put it into perspective just how big this model is, our consultant with a water-cooled computer would hit play and let this model run over the weekend, and the results would come out the other end after a weekend's worth of computing. So this really is pretty new for us to be able to do this kind of analysis. So we look at the data from two perspectives. The first is how much water will the city have in the future? And for this, we use a tree ring study that provided information about wet, dry, and average cycles all the way back to the 1500s. And this provided a ton of good data to produce thousands of potential future conditions that are accurate with the probabilities that we've seen in our history. So the other data we really wanted to fully understand was the other side of that coin. How does our community use water? So we evaluated virtually all of our 33,000 water customer accounts and looked at everything from land use type, age of construction, indoor versus outdoor use. And this really provided a greater in-depth look into that land use water nexus that I mentioned. This provides important information for estimating how much water the community will use in the future in 2040. And it also provides important information about conservation trends and other items that we'll look at here in the next few slides. All right, so there are really three variables that we wanted to look at more closely. So those three variables is development and redevelopment. So obviously the comp plan is very important there. The second is water conservation. How do your water conservation trends impact our ultimate water needs? And then the third was climate change. And we can talk more about that at the end. I know there was the citizen that had expressed some concerns about that, and I have some interesting information that I can share there if there's interest from this team. So the first variable is, how does new development impact our ultimate water supply? And what's really important here is that Westminster is largely built out. There's certainly some remaining open field development. There's certainly some areas of town that we expect will redevelop at some point. But most of our water demand comes from existing customers and is not coming from new customers. So this is a graph. We've shared this with City Council a number of times, talking about the conservation trends that we've seen in the past. And so this bottom kind of orangish brown line is population over time. Of course, population has been increasing, then this is going from the year 2000 up to 2018. And then this blue line is our actual water demand for the entire city over the last 20 or so years. And what's really fascinating about this, especially graphing them against each other, is you can see that that population growth is increasing, but our overall water demand for the city as a whole is decreasing. In the 2014 plan, we did see some of this, but there was concern that a lot of it was driven by what we call drought shadow. And that's just a result of, in the 2002 drought, that was our last major drought. Let's see if I can use the pointer here. So our last major drought was in 2002. You can see that our demand dipped, and then it was lower for a while, and then it came back up. And people get in the habit of watering their lawns and using water After a drought, they kind of get into that habit of using less, but then it kind of starts to increase. And so you can see in the 2013-2014 timeframe, we weren't really sure if this was a constant decrease over time. And so there was not conservation taken into any of those assumptions about what ultimate water demand would be. So this was actually a really interesting analysis. Now with so much more data and so many years to look back on, we're comfortable in saying that there is definitely a downward conservation trend. And we make some of those assumptions in the various analyses that we ran. Okay, so we answered the question of, do we have enough water for today's needs? And then the next obvious question is, do we have enough water for our future needs? And the answer is a little more nuanced. Yes is the short answer, but there's a lot of ifs associated with it. If the city continues to invest in its infrastructure, if the city is successful in a number of water rights legal matters, so there's water court cases that are involved with water rights. One of them is a major case that we're working on right now that will provide a significant amount of water for us. If water conservation trends continue on the same downward trend, and if the city doesn't drastically deviate from existing land use plans. And we'll talk more about that at the end. So caveat, yes, but there's a lot of ifs along with that. Okay. So we started with a baseline scenario that assumes that the city is entirely built out. There are no open green spaces in this scenario. And we assume that water conservation trends continue. So from the previous slide, we assume that there's that same downward trend continuing through the future. There was actually quite a bit of research and analysis that went into deciding whether we thought that conservation trend would continue or not. And we are comfortable in saying that that's likely the case, but certainly it's dependent on how our customers react and if they decide to continue with indoor water fixtures that are more efficient and outdoor landscaping that is more efficient. In this scenario, we do assume climate change is negligible. And like I say, we can talk more about that topic if that's something that the commission is interested in talking about. And the results here are pretty interesting. And generally, the amount of water available that we found was between 23,000 to 23,400 up to 34,500 acre feet. That's a big range of potential water supply. And so that's something that we're very aware of as a weakness in our system. That said, it does bracket the 2014 results relatively well. The water demand was a little more interesting. That came in at 16,000 to 23,000 acre feet. So that's substantially lower than what the 2014 plan water supply plan had estimated. And like I say, that's largely due to those conservation metrics. So since land use and conservation are some of the biggest policy decisions the council makes and this commission is involved in, we wanted to provide a little further results from the water supply plan updated analysis, which shows how important each of these variables are in understanding the ultimate water needs for the city. All right, so this is the interesting slide. And it's fascinating to me. We do all this work, 3 years worth of work and some intensive modeling, and we come up with one slide. But this is where the meat of it is. For context here, this is the 2014 water gap. The y-axis is in acre feet, which is just a unit of measure for water. Imagine a football field that's 1 foot deep. That's about how much water is in an acre foot. Depending on who you talk to, an acre foot of water will serve 3 or 4 single family residents. So that's 2,000 acre foot from the 2014 water gap.
Sarah, can I interrupt for a second?
Absolutely.
What did you say, how much an acre foot will serve? I didn't hear it.
At 3 to 4 single-family residents.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
For a year?
For 1 year. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And that's an important. That's actually a really good question. All of these numbers are acre foot per year. We tend to drop the per year part. So, like we talked about, there is a large variability in water supply. So above the 0 mark here is how much above the 2014 31,300 mark that we could see. And then of course, below that, we can go quite a bit lower than that, what was projected in 2014. And this is really important in helping us understand how vulnerable our city is to things like drought and climate change. This is the impact of land use decisions that we make. So this is a part that Andrew and others in economic development and other parts of the city were really involved in, helping us come up with a number of scenarios for the land use map. And there's a huge part of the comp plan that's super important, but the part we tend to focus on for water supply is that land use map. And those scenarios ranged from kind of this business as usual model that is very similar to the existing comp plan. There is a version that is low development, like it assumes a weak economy, and so perhaps there's parcels that don't develop because they're more challenging to develop. And then we went the other direction. And if you've got questions on this, I'm gonna point you to Andrew so he can help me out. But we went the other direction, and we assumed that there was not just, we weren't just heavily developing undeveloped lands, but we were redeveloping along some of our major arterials to an extent that we would, I suppose would be possible, but not as likely to develop to that level. And we ran the model with these different land use maps. And so you can see that the impact of land use decisions is significant. It's not as significant as the variability in water supply. And as you'll see in a minute, it's pretty interesting to look at the difference between this bar and the impact of conservation trends. So this is the one that I think when we got these results back, this was a bar that we really kind of stood back and looked at for a second. I think it surprised us. It makes sense when you start thinking about it, but we were really surprised to see how impactful water conservation is in determining the ultimate water needs of the city. And so the 0 mark here is our business as usual scenario, where we assume that our conservation trends continue on that same downward trend. We ran other scenarios based on some research that we did that looked at what happens if the city of Westminster takes a more drastic stand and we decide that we no longer want to allow turf grass. That's not something we're talking about, but what would happen if we did that? Or we were more aggressive in the sorts of indoor water fixtures that we allowed. What would that look like in terms of the ultimate water need of the city? And then we went the other direction. What happens if we are investing more heavily in Kentucky bluegrass installations? What happens if we are not pushing for people to use indoor water fixtures that are efficient? So the results of that really are you can see it's more impactful even than the variability that we see in our water supply. And so this is where we say that conservation really is so vital to making sure that the city is able to support itself now and into the future. And it really is certainly how land is developed matters, but what really matters is this conservation trend, along with being resilient against drought. Because those are really the two variables that can impact the ultimate water supply needs.
Sarah, before you go away from this slide, I have a question.
Sure. Absolutely.
Looking at the last graph, impacts of conservation trends. So if we increase our water use, we go into the red area, and if we decrease, we go into the blue area. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
So at the very bottom, the red goes way down. That would be if there was a drought and an increase in use.
So it would be if the city decided that we wanted to plant much more Kentucky bluegrass, if we decided we didn't want to invest in infrastructure, which is important because we actually lose about 7% of our water gets lost in the distribution system between the water plant and people's homes. So the more that you invest in your infrastructure, the less water you lose out of the infrastructure. So there's assumptions there that there's not investment in infrastructure, and that there's just a general turning of directions in terms of going the opposite direction for the conservation trends that we're seeing today. So it's not related to drought, but being more efficient helps us be more resilient against drought.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So before I leave this one, does anyone else have any questions? You can ask more at the end too. So just wrapping things up, there's a number of policy decisions that certainly this group is involved in some of those decisions. And the first one is that supporting conservation practices is truly the single biggest thing the city can do to meaningfully impact resilience against drought, climate change, and development trends. And that number two, supportive infrastructure maintenance and the completion of Wattenberg Reservoir Complex will ensure sufficient facilities are available to continue providing reliable water supply. Drought response is super important to protecting cities from severe drought. I didn't mention that in the presentation, but one thing we learned from this modeling effort was that the worst drought that we've seen in the last century, which happened in the 50s, was actually just an average worst drought based on that tree ring study. So we have about a 50-50 chance of seeing a drought worse than we've seen in the history of the city in the next 100 years. So drought's definitely on our mind. And then the last two are probably of most interest to this group, and that is that there is some ability to make minor changes to land uses beyond the proposed 2040 comp plan. So those can be accommodated as long as conservation trends are continuing. It's really those major changes to proposed land uses that can have negative impact and that we'll really have to consider very carefully. So those are the slides I have. I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, this is Rick. I've got some questions for you.
Yes.
One of the slides, you showed the three levers is development, conservation, and weather. I submit to you that the only lever there is development. Conservations may or may not happen. Weather may or may not happen. The only thing within our control is development. And later on in the presentation, when you started talking about conservation and showing us the graphs, it's easier for a graph to look like all of a sudden we're all woke now and we're all conserving when the price of water doubles. Families are afraid to turn on their faucet. Are we calling that conservation? Are we calling that putting the fear in people that they're going to have to choose between water and eating? We could reduce traffic on our roads simply by adding $1 to the gas tax. Is that a viable way to reduce traffic on the roads? I mean, I see that's where our conservation's coming from. And a large part is, you know, if you look at that graph, it coincides with price. and the population's going up, and it didn't coincide with the water usage going up, because most of our development now is apartments, so you don't have the same water usage you have for the homes. You know, so that plays into it too. And, you know, from a development standpoint, you know, and I mentioned this on our meeting last time, is it seems like our plan for new development is to tell existing families they can't have lawns anymore. And that's not why we live in Westminster. We used to require developers to bring water with them if they wanted to develop something that was going to increase water use. And I understand that developers can't find water. Well, neither can the city. You know, so maybe the answer isn't to build, you know, to keep building, to keep adding water users on the hope that we manage to manipulate the price enough or whatever to get water usage down. Maybe the answer is to get water usage down and show that we can support the development. Because if we put in these developments and we put all this new water demand, and it turns out these assumptions are wrong, now we're in real trouble. We can't go tear all these apartments down and tell all these people they have to leave the city. You know, it just seems like we're setting up a house of cards.
Those are all really great points, and I completely understand the sentiment there. That's certainly something that we've been hearing a lot. If I could respond to a couple of those things, this conservation trend that we've seen in that chart, that downward chart, is something that's not Westminster specific. It's something we're seeing. It's something that all of our neighboring cities are seeing, and it's something that we're seeing across the country. I actually had a high school intern that I was able to mentor recently. She was just graduating from Horizon High School here in Thornton. And she did a really interesting study looking at all the different cities across the country that is in line with what we have seen when we've done the same analyses. But what she found was that these downward trends are not something that's specific to Colorado. They're happening on the East Coast and they're happening on the West Coast. And what's really fascinating is, you know, this was a surprise to me, is that a lot of that water conservation is not happening outside, it's happening indoors. And it's largely because of legislation that's put restrictions on how much water, for instance, a toilet can use. All of the fixtures that are being used now that people can buy at Home Depot, you can't buy fixtures anymore that are not water efficient. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing conservation, but in a different way than what we expected. We expected people are installing xeric landscaping. They're installing something outdoors. But that's not really what's driving a lot of the conservation. It's a lot of indoor conservation. So that's been really interesting for us to learn and see. We see it in our own data. And certainly, not to say we don't care about outdoor watering, that's certainly, you know, that's 50% of the water that we use in a year. So we certainly care about that. But some of the numbers were surprising even to us. So, you know, this connection between development and the push for conservation. We didn't, as a part of this analysis, necessarily connect those things. And the amount of water that we use in the different analyses, so if we use our super dense future land use map, that uses a little bit more water than what our baseline does. It makes a difference. If we make decisions to make every development R36, absolutely, that will have impact on our water supply. If we make decisions to stay largely in line with the existing comp plan and the land use map that Andrew has been sharing, then it is really, it's not as big of an impact to the water supply in the sense that we've already planned for that development. Now, that said, you're absolutely right. It would be silly of me to say that by adding another apartment complex or another development, absolutely, we're going to use more water. Absolutely not saying that. And what I will say is if we decide not to do those developments, we would be less likely to have drought restrictions in the future. But in a world where most of what you do is risk-based, we're never going to be in a place where we have 0% drought, chance of having a drought. There's no amount of planning or expenditures that get us to that point. We deal a lot in managing risk. And what I would say is increasing or building out the city to the comp plan doesn't significantly increase our risk. Changing policies about the sorts of indoor fixtures that we use, the sorts of landscaping that require, those do impact our risk pretty significantly. And so it's not to say that that new construction won't use more water, it will. It's just that the amount of risk that we see from that new development is less than what the impacts of conservation are, if that makes sense. And then you mentioned rates as well. I know that's a hot topic. What I will say is that no part of the water supply plan goes into determining what our rates are, with the exception of we do have the Wattenberg complex is a reservoir complex out near Brayton that we would like to construct, to finish constructing. It was actually in the process for quite some time. That's in the CIP. And that does, is one very small piece of what goes into the rate setting. But besides that, there is not a connection between conservation goals directly, water supply plan directly, and rates. The rates are driven by a lot of work that our utility engineering team works on in making sure that our infrastructure is up and working to the level that we want it. I don't want to dismiss that. I know that's an important topic right now. But from the perspective of the water supply plan, the two discussions aren't linked, at least from my perspective.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That was very helpful.
I'm
Lawrence,
sorry.
did you have a comment?
Yeah, just a quick question. Back towards the beginning, Sarah, you mentioned that there is a legal action in which the city is involved. Could you brief us a little bit on that if you can?
Sure. I can give you some high level. I can't get into the details, but absolutely. A large part of where the city's water rights come from is from purchasing water rights from what were historically rights used by farmers. And so in order for a municipality to use that water, we have to go through a water court process. It's called a change case, where we actually change that use from an agricultural use to a municipal use. And there's a lot of engineering that goes into that. We have to determine exactly how much water did the farm use, how much of it ran off the site. It's really interesting. I could probably go on for an hour. But we have a legal team that includes both attorneys and engineers that help us work through those cases. This case that we're working on right now is a change of use case for a number of FRICO shares. So FRICO is water associated with Stanley Lake that we've over the years bought up these rights and are now changing to municipal use. They're a lot of fun. And I say that facetiously.
I have
Any
two
other-
questions.
Okay, Mr. Tomachek, just asking if there was any.
On one of the slides, you showed a population growth and a conservation line that was downward trending. And you've said several times that you assumed that that conservation trend would continue. Just like any trend, it's eventually going to plateau. How did you determine when that was going to plateau and to what extent?
That is a really great question. That is a topic of conversation that in the industry is being had across the country. There are a number of studies that have been done that look at the amount of water necessary for maintaining basic water service. We are less experts on that. We did talk quite a bit with some larger partners, including Denver Water and some other larger water providers, to make sure that the assumptions that we were making made sense with the data that they were seeing and the research that they had done. It's a big deal. I mean, you do make some assumptions that at some point this will bottom out. But what we're learning is that bottoming out plateau is far lower than what we're projecting over this time period into 2040. We would not want to assume the numbers that the research is showing, because it's 25% of where we're at now. And we don't know how realistic that truly is. So that's a great question. And it's something that it is an assumption. And it's part of how we have to kind of crystal ball what our future looks like. We do the best we can and do the best research that we can in order to minimize that risk.
Okay. That combined with the concern that was expressed about climate change, you indicated that climate change didn't really have an enormous effect, but that weather did. And I know the two are different over the long haul.
So I love this question.
I'm trying to get to, given that our future seems to be more arid and more affected individual years in the weather, how did you predict the future conditions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So we did a number of things. I get the acronym wrong every time. It's the Front Range Joint Climate Change something or other. It's a report. If you're interested, I'm happy to send it to you, where there were a number of analyses done on a variety of climate change models I'm trying to decide how much in the details. Climate change models look at the whole globe, and we have to downsize those to look at the tiny little piece that is our watershed from those giant global models. And that's a lot of what this report did. It helped us identify what are the appropriate models to be using for the Front Range. We used those models in order to adjust how much water was in our watershed. And we did that using a number of different potential futures. So hot and dry futures, warm and dry futures. There are futures where that are actually hot and wet. So a lot of the modeling in the Front Range, almost all of them show increasing temperature, but they are all over the board in terms of how much water we'll get in the future. So some of them are dry, some of them actually show futures that are more wet. So we took those, ran our model using those different climate change models, and then compared those against our paleohydrology. So looking at the tree ring study, looking back to the late 1500s. And what we find is that our history has had huge variability in the amount of water, wet and dry cycles, in that those modeling runs that we ran with the climate change actually fell within the same metrics that we saw in the paleohydrology. That said, there is something that's really interesting. So you asked this question about climate and weather. And as we see climate temperatures increase, what that means is the atmosphere has more potential to hold water in it. And therefore, one of two things happens. You have less water, and so that atmosphere works as a sponge and sucks up any remaining water up into the atmosphere. So you end up with dry conditions. The opposite of that is the atmosphere holds more water. Therefore, when it comes in from somewhere else, it can hold a lot more water and dump a lot more water on us. So it's less to do about the temperature being greater. It's more to do about seeing greater extremes in the weather that we experience. So being prepared for drought, being prepared for flood becomes a much more important part of our planning process.
Those are my two questions. Thank you very much.
Sarah, I have a quick question. Does the city of Westminster require developers to use water conserving appliances, or do they leave that up to the discretion of the developer?
That is a good question. Andrew may jump on and correct me here. I don't believe that there's any restrictions that we have for indoor water fixtures at this point. I know we're working on landscape code for outdoor, but I think what's, Andrew hopped on.
Yeah, I wish we had Drew Beckwith on. We do require the water sense fixtures. It's very much part of our development requirements. Drew Beckwith, who's actually in Public Works and in a different part of Public Works than Sarah's group, he does a tap fee calculation when we have pre-application meetings with developers. And it's a really cool worksheet if you've never seen it. It's an Excel type worksheet, and you plug the stuff in and it gives you different costs. And so it monetizes lower water saving both fixtures as well as the landscape material. And those costs can be really significant. When I was new to Westminster and I came from a place where water was relatively cheaper, I was really surprised. And Drew Beckwith's predecessor, who was Stu Feinglass, some of you may know him from other Westminster work. I had an office building project, and he showed that by doing a different type of toilet fixture that was much lower flowing, actually saved them in the neighborhood of $100,000 in tap fees. So it's very much incentivized to go with those low flow. But to answer the core question there, we do require the water sense fixtures. It's actually a state law from Colorado, I believe. And if there's more questions about that, perhaps Drew could send a follow-up email or something in that topic.
Not really any more questions. I'm glad to hear that you've incentivized it. And it sounds like you use the carrot instead of the stick to encourage developers, which is a great idea. That works much better than forcing. So thank you. Any other questions from commissioners?
I do.
Tracy.
I just, not so much as a question. I just think it's interesting that the city is spending time doing this research, really looking at this closely, and then tying it to land use policy just to kind of anticipate what we're up against in the future. And it's pretty clear that as long as conservation is encouraged and we continue to look for opportunities to have conservation, that it will definitely help. I mean, it's proof that it's helping. And I just think that's interesting. I think it's great that city is so forward-looking and doing these kinds of things. So I have to give you kudos for doing that, because it is a very sensitive topic. And we will continue to have water problems everywhere. I think it's good that you're looking at this, and I just have to take my hat off to you that you've done such a good job researching this. It looks like you've gotten quite a few experts involved, and you've gotten a lot of information. So good job. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. And I'm just going to repeat again how awesome it is. We've got such a great community development team. We were having a conversation with a metro-wide group earlier today, and a lot of water providers are not as lucky as we are to have that kind of cooperation between the different parts of the city. So thanks to the community development team.
And I'd like to echo Commissioner Collins' statement. I'm very impressed that the city is keeping track of this, and you're very knowledgeable, Sarah, and I appreciate that. And I'm glad that the city of Westminster is looking forward and kind of taking into account all the variables. It's impressive. Anyone else like to question or comment?
I have a comment or a request. When the time is appropriate, we're safe. I would love, any of my colleagues as well, I would love to go through a session of how you forecast and the data that you use, and just sit through a session of your team walking through that process of forecasting. I would love to get a better understanding of how you generate that data.
We could spend days and days on it, so.
Well, he was thinking of a short session, I'm sure.
Week long? That's short. No, I'm totally kidding. We're happy to provide whatever information is helpful.
Yeah, one last comment here, and then I'll shut up. As you can probably tell, I come at this from a little different angle. I spent the last part of my career as a risk manager with IBM. And part of my job was to analyze projects and the assumptions and all the numbers and all the charts, and to come up and understand if it didn't work, how could we recover? What will it cost? In the IBM world, I could always just put people on airplanes and fly them in at a cost, but we could calculate that cost. If we do this, and we go ahead and build a development based on these projections, and the projections are wrong, they plateau at the wrong spot, they don't continue, how do we recover? We can't just go buy water, it's not there. We can't kick people out of their apartments. I mean, literally, what do we do at that point? Put everybody on lifelong water restrictions? I mean, that's kind of where I'm looking at this. If it doesn't work, what do we do? Because that impacts all of the long-term people that are been here long-term.
I would say that you're spot on. There is risk in everything, for sure. I would say we're confident in these numbers, but we also don't have crystal balls. So if we didn't build another building today, there could be a future where we run out of water. We could build everything in the comp plan and more, and we could have plenty of water. And that's part of the nature of trying to chart a path forward, is which risks do we feel like are appropriate to take?
Don't understand. I'm just trying to make sure we have a recovery plan if the assumptions are wrong.
No.
there are no more questions, I'm going to thank Sarah and ask her to keep us up to date if anything changes. And I think that's it for this presentation. Thank you, Sarah.
That was great.
Thank you,
All
Sarah.
of you. It was good to
Thank you,
meet all
Sarah.
of
That
you.
was great.
Okay, do we have any old business we need to address? Anyone, anything they need to talk about? Any miscellaneous business? Okay, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, this meeting is
I'll make a motion
adjourned.
to
Thank you,
adjourn.
everyone. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you,
And,
everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.